Okay. Good evening, everybody, and happy Bodhi Day. Great to see you all, and thank you for coming. Okay, what I'm going to say really is a series of unresolved thoughts that I have, really, and it's not supposed to be the be all and end all, and it's not supposed to be the truth or anything like that. It's supposed to be things we might consider as we move forward into a period of uncertainty as an order. And by uncertainty, I don't mean that people have doubts about the viability of the order or anything like that. I just mean, as in all change, it's uncertain where it will take us. As good Buddhists, we should be very familiar with the concept of impermanence and change, and that nothing lasts forever, and change is what life is about. And of course, that brings a certain level of anxiety and uncertainty with it. You'll be surprised to know that I watch a lot of kind of rubbish on the TV as relaxation. Quite often when you see kind of very convoluted plots in programs on Netflix or whatever it might be, I find it quite difficult to follow the plot from week to week. But certain things stick in my mind. And I watched quite a weird program. I think it's called Manifest. And by weird, I mean kind of interesting, really. It's a story about a group of survivors from a plane crash. They survived the plane crash, but they inexplicably aged. Anyway, a kind of subplot to that was what I found a very heartrending and moving subplot. This subplot revolved around a father trying to find his missing daughter. And I think for any parent, the prospect of not knowing where one's young child is absolutely terrifying. Anyway, this poor chap has lost his daughter, who's about 5. And, he's absolutely determined to find out what's happened to her. He has a really strong intention to find her. He receives various clues and various tips. He eventually finds himself in this forest and he can hear a child crying. And he edges through the forest and there's a river. By the banks of this river, there is a small child. The child's back to the hero. He's overwhelmed with emotion because he thinks that at long last, at the end of his search, he has found his missing daughter. He runs up to this child who's sitting on the rock. As he approaches her, she turns round and it is not his daughter, but it is another little girl. And he's absolutely devastated, of course. And this child is crying. He realizes that he has to do something about the child that is in front of him. So he comforts this child. He notices that there is a body floating in the river. He puts 2 and 2 together. This body must be the body of this little girl's father. He has rescued a child, but that child is not the child he was looking for. And I found that incredibly moving in a series which was otherwise quite trite, I suppose you could say. I found this really, really moving, and it kind of lived with me for a number of days. What it illustrates, this poor man had a terrible drive to find his child. And he didn't find his child, but he found a child. At this point in the story, it was not the result he wanted, but it was a good result. He didn't find the child, the lost child, but he found a lost child. There's a huge lesson for us as Buddhists in this, in that people with good intentions are often sneered at. His intentions are good, but they don't live in the real world, or they just do gooders, or whatever it might be. And I think that is so wrong, because I think in Buddhism, intention is everything. Intention is what carries the karmic punch. A lot of people think that it's motivation, the reasons why people do something, that are important. And they are important to a degree, but they're not what brings the karmic result, according to classic Buddhist thinking. It's not why we do something that's important. It is our intention. It is what our intention is. So an example of that would be, some people might say, we live in a dangerous society, therefore we should be allowed to carry knives and guns. If I shoot somebody, it's in self-defense. My motivation was fine. Well, your motivation may well be fine, and that may be very understandable. But your intention was to kill somebody, and that's what carries the karmic load, according to classic Buddhist thinking. So what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is that because this guy looking for his daughter had a good intention, a karmically wholesome intention, even if he didn't get the absolute outcome and result that he wanted, that good karmic intention brought about a good result for another little girl, if not at this point in the story, for his own little girl. How do we apply this to the Amida Order? We intend positive change in the Amida Order. Okay, we intend to move forward, to be more inclusive, if you like, to have this deeply democratic style of meeting together, because our intention is wholesome, although it may not be the result that each individual one of us think was going to happen, because our overall karmic intention was good, then the outcome will be good. And I think this is a time of positive change. So what do we want to do? What are the changes we intend to bring about? What are our good intentions, if you like, in regard to the Amida Order? Well, we want to create and sustain an order which is focused on Nembutsu, which brings us closer to the Pure Land and which can effectively support our Bodhisattva mission and our moving out into the world to help others. I think it's important that in this moving out into the world, as we grow a little bit, we want to sustain people with love. A contemporary Christian theologian called Elaine Graham, who was a professor at Chester University, and she's a practical theologian, and she had this critique of some kinds of Christian activity. And she said that the big mistake that some Christians make is that they think it is their mission in life to create more Christians, where it should be in their mission in life to love people, whatever they are. I would suggest the same with us, really, as we move out into the world. Our primary aim should not be to create more Pure Land Buddhists, so that would be nice, but our primary aim should be to liberate people from suffering, to spread the love, if you like. I see that as a kind of wholesome karmic intention. Whether it would actually turn out like that, who knows? So if these are our intentions, that's great, but we can't be certain that what we do will conform to what we want in every particular. But if we have wholesome intentions as we go forward, and I think we probably all have wholesome intentions, then some sort of good order in both senses of the word will emerge. We can't be certain, but we can't be certain of anything. And I think certainty is overrated. I think as a historian, I do spend a lot of time reading about the past and thinking about the past. I was reading about the changeover in the Western world, in Western Europe, if you like, around about the 17th century. The changeover, and this is a very broad brushstroke, but it's always characterized as a changeover from an age of faith, where the concept of Christendom in Europe held sway. It was assumed unless you were Jewish or a Muslim, you were a Christian, and that was it. It was an age of faith, the age of Christendom. And how with parts of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the growth of kind of rational thought, if you like, the age of faith is replaced by the age of reason by the time you get to the 18th century. And the commentator who was writing about this was saying that one of the characteristics of our age is a quest for certainty. And he was saying that really in the Middle Ages, in the age of faith, people didn't think in terms of certainty. They just kind of tried to cultivate an attitude of faith. Whereas with the scientific revolution, and I'm not knocking the scientific revolution, it's brought us vaccines, it's brought us transport, it's brought us computers, it's healthcare, and all this kind of stuff. I'm not knocking science at all. But when the scientific mentality is all pervasive in society, it tries to live by a system of certainty. Everything has to be nailed down and certain and measured. And as soon as you try and have that certainty, doubt creeps in the back door. And I think this is certainly true in my life. As soon as I try and be absolutely definite in my beliefs, and try and kind of nail them down, this is what I think, this is what I believe in. The following night, I'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I think, I'm not sure about that. The very quest for certainty brings hesitancy and doubt and anxiety in the back door. And I think that one of the valuable things about uncertainty in a time of change is that it reminds us of the limits of our ego. It reminds us that we can't be certain, we can't always be in control, we can't nail it all down and put it in a little box. So in other words, it makes us aware of the limits of our self-power, if you like. But what can we do to be a little bit more certain? What can we do to try and make a little more sure that our good intentions have good results when we're trying to change the Amida Order? And I've got a few kind of ideas about this. First of all, I think we should try and keep an open mind for as long as possible. And in Buddhist terms, I think this is very linked with insight. There's a tradition of Buddhists trying to train themselves in insight, in vipassana meditation, and kind of there's a tradition in Buddhism, in mainstream Buddhism, certainly of reflecting on what we do. That kind of open-mindedness can help us tremendously as we go forward. And so we're not making hard and fast decisions precipitately. We're giving ourselves time and space. I'll give you an example of this. One of our recent meetings, the idea was mooted that we might change the name of the order. And my first reaction to that was, you can't do that. you know, for all sorts of reasons, which I think, you know, some of those reasons I still hold. Like, I think, you know, we've had a short, if troubled life as an order, but I think it's worth hanging on to the good things that we have done alongside some of the stuff that's gone wrong. Anyway, when it first came up, I was quite appalled at, well, not appalled, but I was quite surprised at this suggestion. But I've sat with it for 4 or 5 weeks, and I've started to think, yeah, you know, it might not be a bad idea. Might not be a bad idea. I can see all sorts of reasons why that might happen. The reason I've changed my mind is that I've just given myself time and space to examine a gut reaction, examine the kind of premises behind what I was saying and the assumptions that I was making and my own attachment to certain things. So I think our deep democracy, which we've talked about before, helps with this, because, you know, we've kind of got a reflexivity, a process of insight built into our very fabric, our very existence as an order. And I think that's hugely beneficial. And I think experience has told us that we need to be vigilant about what happens in the order. You know, where do we take our standards of truth from? And that vigilance, I think, is so worthwhile and is lacking in so many organizations, not just religious organizations, but organizations generally. And I think it's a huge, huge advantage if we can be reflexive on our own organization and insightful about ourselves and honest about ourselves. The second thing I think we can do to try and move forward with a bit more certainty is to concentrate on essentials rather than peripheral things. We've got this central Nembutsu practice, which kind of anchors everything. I think that's very useful as well. And we know that that's the essential. That's the essential. And not to worry too much about other stuff. I was reading in Honen's biography about, you know, he obviously, as the archetypal committed Nembutsu practitioner, that was his absolute focus, and everything else was kind of peripheral. And there's a section in this book in which there's kind of question and answers. People come up to Honen and they ask him all sorts of questions. And some of these questions are, to my mind, at least, I mean, there may be some really deep theological reason for this. There's a guy who went up to Honen and said, "Venerable Master, is it okay to practice Nembutsu after eating leeks or onions while the scent of these still remains in the mouth?" And I think, well, you know, I had to turn over the page to see what Honen was going to say. And Honen said, "Nothing should stop you practicing Nembutsu." And I thought this was a brilliant answer, because he wasn't saying don't talk such rubbish, which is, you know, would be the temptation, I think, because you think, for goodness sake, this is a triviality. Nembutsu is about salvation, about the most important liberation, about the most important aspect of Buddhist practice. And here was a guy who was coming up and saying, well, you know, it's just the triviality of what he seemed to be saying. I mean, perhaps that's just my modern take on this, but I think Honen would have shared some of my impatience, really, because he doesn't say don't talk rubbish, because obviously he wouldn't say that, and he doesn't totally discount the idea, but he does say, you know, nothing should stop you practicing Nembutsu, which is a kind of qualified answer, because it might mean that, you know, you shouldn't really eat those because it will stop you practicing Nembutsu. Or is he saying don't be silly? You know, Nembutsu is the main thing. What I'm trying to say to you is we should really keep in mind always what is important in our practice, and treasure that and nurture that, and kind of, you know, hold that in our hearts and minds, really, as we go forward. The other thing I really, really have noticed more and more about our practice is that it is a practice of invocation. In fact, there's a section in the practice book: "To this holy place, to targeters of all worlds, bring your presence now, I pray." I really like that invoking, that inviting into our lives. It is a kind of practice of humility. You know, it's not an arrogance. I'm struck by sometimes when I read books on religion, how many people try and tell God what to do. You know, they kind of, they sort of, I don't know, they know what they want and they project that onto God and tell him to do it, you know. And I think this idea of invocation is far more subtle and opening out. We're inviting the Tathagatas of all worlds into our hearts and minds. And I think that's something really to bear in mind as we go forward. And associated with that is we need to be hospitable to the future. Greet the future as if it's a guest coming into our house, rather than put up barriers against it. All this kind of stuff has resonances in wider society, you know, about attitudes towards refugees and offering sanctuary to people, offering sanctuary to not just people, offering sanctuary to ideas and plans, trying to be welcoming to whatever comes. And I'll keep using these examples from Christianity, and I'm not saying that they're the same, and there's all sorts of differences of emphasis and more than emphasis, of course. But I don't know anything about this, but I'm quite fascinated by the idea of the second coming of Jesus. People who think that Jesus is going to arrive again. And I think this is a very, very powerful idea. And I think, we can learn from that in the sense of, we don't believe that kind of thing, but just awaiting the arrival of the Tathagatas, so awaiting the arrival of the Buddhas in our lives and expecting that. Again, it fits in with the hospitality thing. And I think it's part of our ritual as well. I think when we did our chanting with Sastama and Vajra just now, what are we actually doing there? We're kind of setting out our ritual stall and seeing what happens. We're inviting Amida to be among us and see what happens. And that's a really exciting thing, isn't it? Because we don't know quite what will happen. But if our intentions are good, it may not be the little child we're looking for that walks through our door, but it will be a little child who needs help who walks through our door. So not being afraid. And I am a very conservative, with a small c, kind of anxious and quite timid individual in some ways, but I really feel the need to kind of open up and be receptive to things which may be unpredictable. I think there's a kind of pregnancy, if you like, about our practice that we do all this stuff, and this creates this sense of expectation and excitement. And as the Amida Order moves forward, I think this is really, really good. So we're attending to what might arrive. We must be aware of the bigger picture, I think, as we move forward, the wider society. And I don't mean political, because obviously that's got problems and is contained and distort and all sorts of things. But I mean, about 10 years ago, I don't know if he's still operating, there was a guy in Japan who was an ordained Shin priest called Hidehito Okochi, who's mentioned on Vow 22, actually. He was a kind of radical, or is, as far as I know, he's still around. He was a radical Japanese Shinshu priest. But his radicalism was really in his particular take on the Four Noble Truths, because he constantly pointed out that greed, hatred, and delusion are not just qualities which we carry around with us as individuals in our psyche, if you like, and therefore we need to deal with those things within ourselves. And he wasn't denying that we have to deal with greed, hatred, and delusion in ourselves. He wasn't denying that at all, but he was saying it's also possible that this greed, hatred, and delusion becomes institutionalized in the wider society. Rapacious corporations, enact greed on a huge scale. You can see hatred is not just individual people hating each other, but becomes institutionalized in expansionism, in what's happening in the world at the moment. Countries just walking into other countries and so on and so forth. As we move forward, as well as dealing with our own individual flaws and our own bamboo nature and trying to come to terms with that, but recognize the wider society is bamboo as well. We'll each have our own ideas about how we relate to those wider currents in society, those wider aspects of society. I've got here, remember, and I'm not quite sure what I mean by this, remember that the Pure Land is a question, not an answer. I think you could probably shoot me down a lot over this, really. But what I mean by that is our religious practice is to discover what a Pure Land is. I'd much rather phrase it like that rather than to get to the Pure Land, is to discover what a Pure Land is. We're constantly challenged every day. How can we bring what we're doing a little bit close to the Pure Land? And I think that's, personally speaking, and I know not everybody will agree with me on this, but I think that's not a bad way of kind of moving forward, really. We have to kind of stay vulnerable. Again, it's a question of being open, but keep vulnerable to what is going on in the outside world. And how does this help us answer this question about where is the Pure Land? What is the Pure Land? What is the Pure Land in our lives? What is it that stops our lives being lived in the Pure Land? And the very final thing that I want to say to us is a couple of examples of Buddhist resilience over the ages. Sometimes, I think, particularly when, we're only a small order, but when we were going through a bit of a crisis a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of anxiety about whether we would actually survive. And I think we have survived, thanks to the efforts of a lot of people, particularly Sastama. We have survived. A couple of examples of survival from earlier in Buddhist history, just to kind of finish off with, really. In the early years of the Common Era, Buddhist texts and sutras were taken by pilgrims from India down what is now the Silk Road, or the combination of roads that's now the Silk Road, to China, where they were translated into Chinese, and then eventually through Korea to Japan. But that journey was tremendously arduous, and these sutras were taken on the backs of camels, across frozen mountain ranges, parched deserts, constantly vulnerable to bandits and the vicissitudes of the weather. They arrived at this temple in Chang'an, which is now Xi'an in China, called the Temple of the Wild Goose Pagoda. And even when they got to the Wild Goose Pagoda, if they survived, these sutras were still very vulnerable. The Wild Goose Pagoda burnt down on several occasions, but they survived. You know, the teaching survived. You know, they got to Japan and they got to us and so on and so forth. All sorts of things have happened to us, but we haven't been attacked by bandits or had to, you know, go on camel rides across deserts. I've got a photograph of me standing outside the Temple of the Wild Goose. I was very moved when I arrived at this Wild Goose Pagoda. It's just one of the experiences of my life, really. But another example, in ancient India, a place called Nalanda was the greatest Buddhist seat of learning, and it had the largest library in the ancient world. In the winter of 1193 to 94, Nalanda University was destroyed by a warlord and his 200 armed horsemen. It took them several months to burn the library, and the smoke from the burning sutras hung over surrounding hills for days after they'd finished. In a footnote in his book on India's Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, the historian Charles Allen relates how, about 40 years after the fire, a Tibetan monk named Dharma Swamin arrived in Nalanda. Dharma Swamin found just one survivor, a 90-year-old monk who was teaching a class of students from a Sanskrit book, the only manuscript to have survived the inferno. When the students fled after the rumor of another impending attack, the elderly monk passed the text to Dharma Swamin, who returned to Tibet with it. The point I'm trying to make is that survived. You know, that text survived. All sorts of things came to an end. Change is natural and uncertain, but things do survive. At various times in its history, you know, Buddhist sutras have passed through the valley of the shadow of death, if you like. They've come pretty near to being eliminated, but they've survived. We as an order, as I said, we haven't been through anything as dramatic as that, thank goodness. Trying to reform the Amida Order is what the Amida Order is about. We're kind of committed to change in a positive direction, aren't we? This is the nature of our being, really. We should grasp it and not be afraid of it. But anyway, thank you so much. As usual, I've rambled on for far too long. Namo Amida Bu. Thank you.
Namo Amida Bu. Thank you very much.